Welcome to the Sunday Sessions podcast, a ministry of Cuyahoga Valley Church. Sunday Sessions is a weekly exploration of some of the most important topics and ideas in Christianity. Each week, we bring you thought-provoking content designed to equip you to follow Jesus more passionately. No matter where you are in your walk, there's always something new to discover. Whether you're looking to expand your knowledge or be challenged in new ways, this is the place for you. Let's get started.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. So this week, we are looking at church history again, the second of 4 lessons we're going to be doing this. Last week, we kind of wrapped up the Reformation, looking at a lot of different history all at the same time. Great fun. This year, we're looking at the years 17 to 1800. And I was just talking to Rich Anko, who's going to be teaching next week. Really excited to have him on board for that. But we were talking about how the big challenge in teaching this church history class has been deciding what not to say. So today, there's so much content we're not going to cover of things that happened during this time period as it relates to the church. But there is some stuff we are going to be able to focus on. So if you leave here today and you think, Becca didn't even mention this really important thing I know about, you're right, because there's just so much when we're talking about 100 years of recorded history. So just a reminder, we have 2 more weeks after this of church history, and then we'll be jumping into our apologetics mini-series. Rich is going to teach next week, and then Joe Valenti is going to wrap up our church history mini-series. And in our apologetics series, we're going to have a number of guest teachers, including Kyle Gustafson, Jennifer Gratz, Josh Ham, and some other people. Rich is going to be teaching for us again, and some other people that are kind of returning guest appearances. So I'm really excited about that. It's going to be great fun. But with all that said, let's dive in to looking at church history from the 1700s to the 1800s, so 1700s. Earlier this year, right before I had my daughter, one of the last books I read before she was born, and honestly one of the last books I read this year, was a book called Remaking the World, How 1776 Created the Post-Christian West. And this is that book. It's by a guy named Andrew Wilson. He's the teaching pastor at King's Church London, and he has degrees in history and theology from Cambridge and King's College. So really intelligent, educated guy. But this book is all about how the year 1776, more than any other year in history, paved the way for the West. So thinking primarily about Western Europe, about the United States, etc., to become post-Christian than any other year before or since. So he's talking about the way that secularization has kind of seeped into, I guess, the culture, the zeitgeist of our world today. And he talks about different categories in 1776 that include globalization, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, the Great Enrichment, or just how people became so much more wealthy in this century and in the year 1776, the American Revolution, the rise of post-Christianity, and the dawn of Romanticism. And he explains their relevance to things that happen today. And in all that, he demonstrates how a number of political and philosophical, economic and industrial changes in the year of America's founding shaped the modern West into a weirder society. So that's an acronym that stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, Democratic, Ex-Christian, and Romantic. So it's a lot. And thanks Logos for that description, because that's a lot more concise than I could have been. So we don't have time to talk about everything in this book or go over all those categories, but I bring up this book for 2 reasons. Number one, it's a great read. It's written really accessibly. Andrew Wilson is a great author, so if you'd like, to learn more about American history, to learn more about the history of the West, and also think more about how history and theology are 2 stories that are woven together, this is a great book to do that. And then number 2, we're going to look at a couple of the categories in this book today. Not all of them, because when we think about the 1700s and when we think about church history in the 1700s, one of the most significant stories to tell is how outside influences in the world changed what was happening in the church. So we know that nothing happens outside of God's sovereignty, but we also know that the story of the world around us is in many ways also the story of the church, because the church exists inside the story of history, right? We exist in a place, in a moment, in a time, and the things that are relevant to us are in some ways shaped by Scripture, but are also shaped by the things that happen to us. So we're going to use a couple of those categories today. And so for this lesson, we're going to be zooming in a little bit and talking primarily about Western Christianity, primarily in the English-speaking world. So this isn't to say that the rest of the church didn't do anything interesting in this time period, right? That's not true. Lots of things were happening all over the world in this century. But when we think about what's relevant to us today, when we think about the influences outside of Scripture that have shaped the way that we do church, and also when we think about what I am best equipped to teach you, both of those exist in the English-speaking world. So that's where we're going to be spending most of our time. So with that, we're going to dive into some discussion, and then we're really going to get started. So we have 2 questions. If you have the note sheet, they're in there. Number 1, what do you remember learning in school? So think elementary school, middle school, and high school about what happened in the history of the U.S. and Great Britain during the 1700s. I want you to kind of go back in your mind and think like, okay, what was I learning about this time period when I was 9 years old? And why do you think it's important to consider secular history when we're talking about church history? So you guys discuss, and then in a minute, I'm going to get back up and we'll keep moving. All right, so for the sake of time, we're going to keep moving. I hope your discussion was helpful to you as we keep moving today. I do want to ask just maybe one. Deb, you looked really excited to discuss this. So what did you guys talk about over here for either question?
I don't remember a whole lot.
I wondered if that was what you were thinking. Was there anything that did stand out to you that you were like, oh, we talked about this? Right? No, that's a good point. In the TV show Parks and Recreation, any Parks and Recs fans? Nobody? Oh, then it's not a helpful tidbit. But one of the characters who's like really libertarian, his name's Ron Swanson, one of his quotes in the TV show is, "History began in 1776. Everything before that was a mistake." And it's obviously a joke, but I think sometimes, like, yeah, in our psyche, I'm the same way. I'm like, oh, right, in 1776, the U.S. decided that the colonies decided they wanted independence, and then we move into the 1800s and some stuff happened. But it's like a joke, but it can sometimes be the case that that's kind of the way our view of history can be. So it's good for us. It stretches us when we look at other time periods. And when we think about the history of Christianity or the history of the church, I think sometimes I have like medieval Christianity and then the 1800s and whatever happened in the middle. Like, you know, we've got the Reformation in there too, but we can have blank spots. So that's one of the things we want to kind of unpack today for us. So thanks for discussing. So today we're going to look at a few key developments that happened in the 1700s and then a few key players, a few key characters, and then we're going to take some time to wrap it all up. So first, we're going to spend some time talking about the Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment is really a backdrop in which all of history was happening. So the Enlightenment, according to Britannica, was a European intellectual movement that happened in the 17th and 18th centuries in which ideas concerning God, reason, nature, and humanity were synthesized into a worldview that gained wide assent in the West and that instigated revolutionary developments in art, philosophy, and politics. Okay, so basically what does that mean? During the Enlightenment, reason, or the use of our faculties, became trusted more and more, and at the same time, authorities were questioned in a way they hadn't been before. So we can see this in politics. When we think about American political happenings in the 1700s, the colonies said, okay, why are we part of Britain? Like, we could not be. We could change that. And we see it in the church following and during the Reformation, when reformers more and more said, okay, why do we listen to the authority figures around us? We need to wrestle with things for ourselves, and we, the people, can come up with a better plan than the existing authority has told us. So that is kind of an idea that shaped the 1700s in a lot of ways, and the Enlightenment was this movement wherein that was happening in tons of different spheres, in academia, in religion, in universities, in politics. People were starting to question others and starting to have more faith in themselves. And really, the world was never the same after this. So if you were in our series last fall on world religions, one of the religions that I talked about in the class was secular humanism. We also talked about universalism that week as well, which they're kind of pseudo-religious ideological camps that can weave together and be separate. But I talked a little bit about the Enlightenment in that class, because as we trace the line of religious history in the United States, and as we look at church history too, we see that the Enlightenment influenced that time period and us today. Not only what people consciously believed then and now, but also subconscious belief about the meaning of life, about God, about themselves, about purpose. So here's a little bit of what I said in that class, because it ties really well today in what we're talking about. So Dean Halverson is a guy who wrote The Compact Guide to World Religions, and he writes that during the Enlightenment, people began to elevate science to the level of being the ultimate test of truth. So today, it can be hard for us to grasp how big a shift this was, because from the time of Constantine, the church had really been, for many people, the arbiter of truth. Like, what does the church say? That is what we believe. Not only in areas of theology, but scientifically, politically. What the church says is what we believe. Religious belief of some kind almost always constituted ultimate belief for most people. For Christians, for Muslims, for pagans. And so it was a huge shift when society began to hold up this broad idea of science as the final judge on matters of reality. So Glenn Scrivener, I quoted him a lot in that series. He's author of The Air We Breathe, which is a book about how the world today is influenced by Christianity in ways that we don't always even notice. So he talked about how our societies today, especially in the West, can think of scientists as fair, calculating searchers and bringers of truth to the masses, right? We think of someone who studies science as someone who knows stuff and can show us stuff. Think about even the way that scientists are portrayed in media today, right? Like, every once in a while, we've got the evil scientist. But a lot of times, we've got like people who love reason and want to show the world truth. And then think about how religious people are often showed in shows today. Like, I know when I'm watching a show that I like and there's a religious person, especially a Christian, I'm like, oh no, they're going to be so weird and like probably bad. And it's tiring. And that's a silly example, but it allows us to kind of unpack how our culture today thinks about what is true and what is trustworthy. Our Western society is influenced in so many ways by the rise of the importance of the scientific method and scientific thought, which arose in many ways during the Enlightenment. And it isn't just outside of the church that this was happening. We see some of this inside of the church as well. But the Enlightenment wasn't the only thing we're going to look at. We also need to talk a little bit about the Industrial Revolution, because it greatly changed society as a whole during this time period, and it changed the landscape of the church around the world. So the Industrial Revolution was a time period in modern history which saw the process of change from an agrarian handicraft economy to one dominated by industry and machine manufacturing. So these technological changes introduced novel ways of working and living and transformed society. That's also from Britannica. A lot of our official definitions are from them today. So when I think about the Industrial Revolution, one of the books I always think about, although it came a lot later, is The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. So he was a journalist who wrote a book as a way to reveal to the public some of the horrific working conditions of the Chicago meatpacking industry in the early 1900s. So we're not talking about that today. Why does the Industrial Revolution make me think of Upton Sinclair? The Chicago meatpacking industry in the 1900s was predated by terrible urban working conditions in the 1800s and even the 1700s, when machines were becoming more and more a part of everyday life, when production lines were becoming a thing. People went from living on farms primarily and living in agrarian society to living in closer quarters, in urban centers, working in closer quarters. Society was changing because of this. Cities were growing. More and more people were beginning to congregate in the same places. More and more people were literate. They were beginning to read the same books, listen to the same preachers, be informed of the same things in a way that had never happened in the same way before. One of the things we talked about at, I think it was the beginning of church history, was that for a long time, before people were literate, before we had maps, you would grow up in one place your whole life, and if you left there, you would just assume you could never come back, because how would you make sure you could find it again? Which is just crazy for us to think about. And already by the 1700s, the world was changing because people could read, and there was available stuff on paper, which there hadn't been before, and people lived together in bigger groups than ever before. So the Industrial Revolution was a huge piece of the puzzle, and some historians say it can be traced from around 1760 to 1840, but the seeds of this movement took place even before that. And all of this matters to us because the Industrial Revolution, like the Enlightenment, paved the way for some of the ways that God worked and moved during this time period, where ideas were being spread, people were asking questions, and the gospel was able to kind of move around the world in a way that hadn't happened as easily before, such as in movements like the Great Awakening, as we're going to talk about. So the next thing we want to look at is the founding of the U.S. We're not going to spend quite as much time here, but when we think about the church in America in the 1700s, this is part of the conversation. It just is. So the breaking away of the 13 colonies from Great Britain was a hugely important thing. The seeds of democracy that were planted in the U.S. eventually made their way to other places. Mark Knoll, author of Turning Points, cites some of the events surrounding the French Revolution as being particularly important in the context of church history, as ideas about freedom and liberty and democracy spread around the world. But this matters for us in thinking about church history, particularly because it was against this backdrop that more and more people around the world started to believe not only that nations and city-states should be able to worship as they wished, but also that individuals should be able to worship as they wished. So this is one of the things in talking about the Reformation that we talked about, where for a long time, even the early reformers couldn't conceive of an option where people who lived next to each other were choosing different ways to practice religion in peace. So we've got Martin Luther working with the German princes, where he's influencing them and saying, hey, the Germanic region needs to be Protestant now. Or we've got John Calvin and his followers in the city of Geneva saying, okay, the church is going to decide what theology we believe, but then the government's going to enforce it. And anybody who doesn't believe what we believe either needs to leave or is going to face really negative consequences. But for the first time in the 1700s, you start to see how the Enlightenment ideology and technological development of the Industrial Revolution created this environment where new types of ideas could flourish. You've got the Puritans, say, in Europe, being persecuted, some of the Anabaptist groups that we talked about, saying, I don't think I should have to follow the Christian practice of my government. B, if they're not going to allow me to practice my religion in the way I see fit, I now have the ability to get on a boat and go somewhere far away where they can't enforce what they want. And I have the belief that all of those things are important enough for me to risk my life and livelihood to do it. So all of the societal change is really a big piece of the puzzle when we look at church history. When we think about worshiping freely, when we think about freedom of religion, all of these ideas started to grow in the 1700s, and it's totally interwoven with what we see when we think about American independence. Because these same people who said, I deserve to worship freely, also at the same time were thinking, I also deserve to practice government the way I want to. I'm not necessarily going to allow the authorities around me to tell me what I need to do. So all of this is very American as well, right? We see how these seeds that were planted in this time, they still exist in our society today. And they've become part of the air we breathe. As we talk about of course everyone should be able to practice religion next to each other. Of course people shouldn't be persecuted for the religious or political beliefs that they hold. This is the air we breathe now because of things that happened in the 1700s. So again, looking backwards, if you were in our Sunday sessions class when we did Baptist Faith and Practice, it was the first thing we recorded. It was right after the Old Testament overview. I taught a class on religious liberty. And some of what I talked about in that class dovetails nicely today too. So in the early days of U.S. history, before it was even a country, many of the early states had a state religion, just like the places they had come from, formally or informally. There was one form of religion, pretty much always one form of Christianity, to which everyone was supposed to adhere. And it was kind of ironic because a lot of these people had fled from religious persecution, and now they had become the religious persecutors, right? They said, good, we got away from the religious persecution, and now we can practice like we want, and we can make sure everybody else does too. But to be fair to them, this was all they knew at the time. For those coming from England, many of them had grown up in a state, in a country where the Church of England was the state-endorsed religion at that time. So taxes taken from individuals by the government, some of those went to the state church, and everybody was expected to be a part of that church. So that's the system that some of the early Americans, but they weren't Americans yet, started implementing. And in this system, just like over the water with the Anabaptists, the Baptists were usually not in the majority, and they were often persecuted. So Thomas Kidd, he's a professor of history at Baylor, he writes, however bad our political problems might seem now, Revolutionary-era Baptists had it worse. American Christians can be quick to use the word persecution today, but Baptists in revolutionary America knew what this word meant, because they did not wish to attend or financially support the established churches of Virginia, Massachusetts, and other colonies. Baptists and other dissenters faced fines, confiscation of property, and imprisonment. So dozens of Baptist ministers in Virginia were jailed for illegal preaching right up until the outbreak of the American Revolution, when other stuff was deemed more important. Figures like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison opposed religious persecution on the basis of Enlightenment principles. So that's important. We can see how these things were working together. But they witnessed the results of persecution firsthand in Virginia due to the mistreatment of Baptists. So Madison, who was an Anglican, wrote in the early 1770s how much he deplored the principle of persecution. So we start to see how all of these things are interwoven. And it was the Baptists in a lot of these states who were writing to James Madison, to some of these other big shakers and movers in the 1700s in the US, saying, we need to build into our Constitution religious freedom, or it's not going to happen. It needs to be mandated by the government that people can practice religion as they see fit. And once the revolution began, Baptists and others really began advocating, first in Virginia, that it drop its religious establishment. And then that's where we see the Virginia Declaration of Rights in 1776, which affirmed that all citizens would enjoy free exercise of religion. And then we see this later in the First Amendment to the Constitution. So it was Baptists who again and again pleaded for religious liberty. There were others too, but Baptists were always a part of this movement. And because they had experienced persecution, they wanted not only themselves, but everyone to be able to practice religion freely. So that kind of is important to keep in mind, that not only, it's interesting to think about Baptists were saying, we don't want our religion to be state religion, we want no state religion. So, man, there's so much we can cover. But as important as this theological truth was then, it remains important today. And we start to see something that we saw first in the Reformation as well, that more and more churches in the U.S. were becoming places where church membership wasn't something that you were just born into, where you decided to be a part of a church, where church membership was something you select into. Often, but not always, this went hand in hand with believers' baptism, definitely always with Baptists, and it also went hand in hand with a type of evangelism that wasn't going to exist before, where you had state-sponsored churches. Like, you did have evangelism there, but it was also easier to assume, like, well, of course Janet's a Christian. She was born into the Anglican Church. Whereas if you have churches made up of members who choose to be there, you start to kind of have an us-them, which can be a bad thing at times, but it can also be good, because it's very clear to say, my friend Janet does not go to church. I know she's not a part of a church. She says she's not a part of a church. Therefore, I must take the gospel to her. So none of this can be separated. But this takes us to our last historical moment we're going to look at today, the Great Awakening. And the other things we've looked at have been a little bit more secular movements that influenced the church, but the Great Awakening was a religious revival in the British American colonies from 1720 to 1740-ish, the first Great Awakening. So it happened under the leadership of John Wesley, George Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards, and others, and it revitalized religion in the colonies right before the American Revolution. And to help us understand the Great Awakening a little bit better, we're going to watch a short video. It's like 2.5 minutes long, and it just covers a little bit more than I could cover on my own. So if you'll wait 1 second, we're going to pull that up and watch that together. So in many ways, as we think about the story of Christianity, the story of the church in the U.S. in the 1700s, it's a story of change, right? Even when we think about just the Great Awakening, we see that we over time, did develop these established churches. And then in the Great Awakening, we had ministers coming from outside, preaching the gospel, not in the context of a church, but just out for everybody, anybody who wanted to come, in a much more emotional way than was happening before. And you have more and more people coming to faith, but then you also have more denominations starting or changing. You have people leaving the Church of England for political reasons, saying, I believe that we should be our own country, and I believe that we should have our own churches. And you also have people leaving these established, liturgical type churches for religious and theological reasons, saying, I want to worship in a new way. I was influenced by this traveling minister who came from this new background, and I want to be a part of that. And so as we think about this era, and as we think about the church in this time period, specifically in the colonies, we see a church that is constantly changing. Practice is changing, church practice. We see theology changing, specifically when we think about the founding of Methodism, and we think about John Wesley and George Whitefield and their influence on that. We think about the rise of kind of a new Calvinism when we think about Jonathan Edwards. So we see constant change happening, and we see the Lord moving in all of it, right? God is a God who is sovereign, and I think one of our takeaways, which we'll talk a little bit more about this at the end, can be that even though everything in society felt really uncertain, right? This is a time period where the Great Awakening is happening. People are coming to Christ, but people are leaving the churches they grew up in. Traveling ministers are having a big influence on people in a totally new way. Also, there's a lot of political unrest. In the colonies, there are people who think we should stay with Great Britain, people who think we shouldn't. This could have been a really uncertain time for people. Even in the midst of all of that, even in the midst of political uncertainty and religious change, God was sovereign and God had a plan. And looking back, we can see how God was moving in all of this. But when we think about political uncertainty and religious change, that sentence I just said could also apply to us today, right? Where we say, this is a really politically uncertain time. There's a lot of change in the way society thinks about religious values. What will we do? I think it's easy for us in the present to always feel that way. But the people who come after us will be able to see more clearly, even than we can now, that God is always working and moving, and he remains sovereign no matter what. One of the things that I think we talked about this in our Old Testament class in here is that when we look backwards at Old Testament characters, their faithfulness can be hard to see because we know the story, right? Like when we think about Abraham and Sarah waiting for a child and desiring a child, we're like, oh, but that wasn't really hard because we know Isaac's coming. Or when we think about Noah building this ark and everybody around him saying, like, you're building a really big boat, like for what? We've never seen rain. We think to ourselves, that probably wasn't that difficult for him. He had faith because we know the water was coming. But when we think about our own lives, it feels so different because we don't know what's coming. We don't know what God's going to do. And neither did those people. Neither did people in Scripture who were seeking to be faithful and called by God to be faithful. And neither did the people in the 1700s seeking to follow the Lord and thinking, God, what is happening? Like, I just want to follow you, and all this crazy political stuff is going on. I just want to know you, and people are leaving our church because this guy named John Wesley came to town. When we look back, we can see some of what God was doing, and we can trust him with the rest. But in the midst of our lives, that can be a lot harder to do. So that is one thing to hold on to as we keep moving. So the last thing we're going to do today before we kind of bring it home is talk about just a few key players. Three of these, the last three, are some of those guys we've been talking about in this video and before. We're going to look a little bit at John Wesley, George Whitefield, and Jonathan Edwards. But before that, I want us to take just a minute to talk about Immanuel Kant. So he was not a part of the Great Awakening in the U.S. He was also not even really a Christian, but he's a really important character as we think about some of the thought that influenced Christianity. Though he grew up in and around Christianity, his adult life was not spent following Christ at all. He was a philosopher, and he doesn't have a ton in common with the other three men we're going to talk about, all of whom were connected with the Great Awakening in the U.S. in some fashion. But Kant is important because of how much he and his work have influenced Western thought and Western philosophy, both formally and informally. An understanding about Kant helps us understand the zeitgeist of the 1700s in the West, and it also helps us understand the people around us today who don't know Christ and some of the presuppositions they may carry about the world, about themselves, and even about the meaning of life. And we were going to, but do not have time to, watch a video on Immanuel Kant. But the main thing we were going to look at in that video, I'm just going to kind of summarize because we're going to run out of time, is there's so much we could go over. But one of the things Kant was really trying to do, he grew up in a type of Christianity. He lived in Europe. He was a philosopher. But he said, basically, I think the things in the Bible are true, but I want to be able to explain them without the Bible. And one of those things is the categorical imperative. So if you've ever studied philosophy, you may have learned about the categorical imperative, and it's kind of a fancy way of saying two things. Number one, view other people not as means to get what you want, but as an end in themselves. So where are we going with this? Basically, Kant was saying, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And you might be thinking, well, that's in Scripture, right? Yes, it is. But Kant wanted to be able to kind of invite people to live out Christian ideals without attaching religious language to them. And that's important when we think about secular society today in the West. One of the books I talked about earlier is Glenn Scrivener's The Air We Breathe, and his book is all about that. It's all about how, in so many ways, the things that we believe in the back of our heads, that we see in PBS specials as kids, that we encounter in restaurants with other people, we see Christian ideals divorced from Christianity, right? We value women and children. We believe that sick people should have access to health care. We believe that people who don't have enough food, we should give them enough food if we have food. We believe that we should generally be kind most of the time. All of these broad strokes, they come from philosophy that has roots in people like Immanuel Kant, who really were consciously saying, I think religion has some good stuff in it, but who wants to submit to God? How can we get the good stuff out of here so that I can still live how I want, but I can kind of ensure that society can still work? So as we think about Immanuel Kant, he was one of the people who wrote about that, and also wrote about how basically people are good. When we encounter beautiful things in the world, it helps us remember that we're good. So we need to encounter beauty often so that we can all be good people together. You can see how this type of philosophy began influencing really the founders of the U.S., who were saying, okay, we want to write that it's self-evident that all people are created equal. In one of the early drafts of some of our founding documents, Thomas Jefferson actually wrote much more religious language. And I wish I could remember it. It's in the 1776 book. We believe that God tells us that all people are equal. And Benjamin Franklin said, no, we don't want to tie this back to God. We want to have this exist apart from God. Some of that Kantian ideology. We want to say that it's self-evident. What does that mean? We find the truth in ourselves, that all men are created equal and have these unalienable rights. We don't want to root that in anything else. So as we start to think about the development of the U.S., it's all connected, basically, is what I'm saying. So last, we're going to talk about these three big players. We've got John Wesley, George Whitefield, and Jonathan Edwards. So John Wesley, he was born in London. He was part of the Methodist movement in the Church of England. He basically was the Methodist movement for much of his life. And during his lifetime, he and his brother Charles, who wrote a lot of hymns that we still sing today, like Come Thou Long Expected Jesus, that we sing at Christmas, that's Charles Wesley. Christ the Lord is Risen Today. I don't know if you're familiar with that one. That's to Charles Wesley. So John and Charles came to the U.S. on several missionary movements, on missionary trips, really. The first was to Savannah, Georgia. Not super successful. They did start a church, but then they went home. Then they came back, and the second trip, the trips that came after were really successful, and John Wesley preached the gospel around the U.S., calling people to, a renewed Christian practice within the Church of England. However, on his deathbed, he finally admitted to everyone who had been telling him this for a long time, you accidentally started a new denomination, which he definitely did. So Methodism started as kind of a call to faithfulness in the Church of England in both Britain and the U.S., but by the end of his life, it had really turned into a new movement. The Methodist Church had kind of been born. And John Wesley was a big part of that. He was an itinerant preacher. He spread the gospel. He wanted to make sure that people heard the gospel who might not be involved in a church, and he wanted to send them back to what he saw as the faithful Church of England that just wasn't reaching enough people. So that's kind of John Wesley. George Whitefield, he was also born in England, but he moved to the U.S. He died in Massachusetts in 1770. He was also an evangelist in the Church of England who, in his preaching, stimulated a Protestant revival. So he was one of the earlier players, even though he and Jonathan Edwards are about the same age. He got started earlier, and he was one of the big players of the Great Awakening. He also, after the Wesleys, went to Savannah, Georgia, started an orphanage there, which is fascinating. And he traveled around the U.S. He preached in a really emotional style, like that video was talking about. And George Whitefield, growing up, he had a big interest in theater. So his preaching was really animated, really loud. He had a voice that could carry across fields, and he would preach outside. And people who were in lots of different churches, they would go to their church and think, this is a little bit boring. And then they could go to a field and hear George Whitefield yell about why the gospel was so important and tell these stories from the Bible, acting out the characters. And they would think, well, that's a lot more fun, so I want to do that instead. So that's where we have these old lights who were people in the U.S. who were pastors in established churches who really didn't like these new guys coming in and being so much more exciting than they were. They would have church members come and be like, that was a great message or whatever, pastor, but I really like that George Whitefield guy. Could you preach a little bit more like him? So you had a little bit of tension. George Whitefield isn't necessarily remembered today as much as Jonathan Edwards or John Wesley, but he was a really important player and influenced Jonathan Edwards a lot. So Jonathan Edwards, he was an American. He was not born over the sea in Great Britain. He was really influenced by Puritanism. He was also a big player in the Great Awakening, and he was one of the forerunners of Protestant missions as we start to see it in the 1800s. So he died in 1758, but his influence really outlived his life. So he was influenced by the Puritans, but he was also really influenced by naturalists and scientists, which was kind of interesting and new because a lot of the established churches at the time were a little bit skeptical of some of the rationalism of the Enlightenment. But Edwards kind of thought that we should talk about the gospel in a way that appeals to people's minds. So he went to university when he was 13. He was a really brilliant guy. I just learned this, wrote a little book on the life cycle of spiders. So he was one of those people who was just always dabbling in things. He was really interested in the work of Sir Isaac Newton and John Locke. And he desired to preach to those that he encountered in his travels because he had a church in Massachusetts, but also then for a while, traveled and preached in fields as well. He wanted to engage with people intellectually and spiritually, which is something that we encounter today in the way that seminaries are put together in classes like this. This ideal has kind of exists still today. And in this way, it's possible to see how the Enlightenment really influenced Jonathan Edwards and the way that he preached to people and the way that his theology developed. So Edwards is known in particular for this sermon mentioned in the video, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which was really a really colorful message. You can still find a transcript online. Basically in this, he talked with really graphic language about how if you don't know Christ, if you don't trust in Christ, you will experience the wrath of God. And I encourage you to look that up because the way that he preached this would definitely not fly in a church today, right? It's kind of an angry feeling sermon. But Edwards believed that any preaching that pointed people to their need for Christ was a win. So that was kind of his heart and soul. He wanted people to understand what it means to be separated forever from God so that they could turn to Christ and understand the gift of salvation that only comes from Christ. So that is an idea that's really kind of a part of the way we evangelize today, and some of the roots of it can be found in Jonathan Edwards, and understanding the gift of what Christ has done through understanding our own sinfulness and our own separation from God. So when we think about the Great Awakening as well, it's important for us to remember this is something that the Lord was using. That it was something that the Lord used to draw many, many people to him, really leading up to and before and during the time period of the American Revolution. And it's something where we can still kind of see, fingers of this movement spread out into things we believe today, especially in the U.S. So we're going to have a discussion before we end our time, before we wrap it up. 2 questions. What is something new you learned today about the 1700s, either regarding secular or church history? And based on our time in Sunday sessions today, where do you see the impact of events in this time period in our world, our country, or our churches, specifically in the U.S. today? So take some time to chat, and then I'll come back up. All right, so thank you guys for discussing. It's so much fun to see you guys talk with each other about what we've been talking about. So as we wrap up, I wish we had like a million more minutes, but I did want to pull up what I wanted to make sure I gave you correct information. So Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration of Independence, he wanted to use the phrase, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." So it was rooted in religious language. Like, this is a sacred thing, so we can't question it because it's what God believes about us. And Benjamin Franklin wanted to change it to self-evident to make clear that these truths were not based solely on religious belief, but were evident to reason. So he wanted to say, it's evident to us when we use our reasonable faculties. We don't need to bring God into this, that all people are created, or all people, well, we have the created language, but all people are equal. So the truth is so clear that we never need to question it, and we don't need to root it in the sacred. So that is a really interesting tidbit to me. I learned that from Andrew Wilson's book about 1776, so another encouragement for that book. So, as with every church history Sunday sessions class, it's so important. I've said this a couple times. It's important to remember that God is sovereign. His purposes prevail, and he's never surprised by the things that surprise us. Not in 1700, not in 1776, not in 2024. Rising secularism, the Industrial Revolution, the colonies gaining independence in the Americas, none of this shocked God, and he worked in and through all of it. In this century of intense and immense change in the world and in the church, I'm sure it was easy for Christians to wonder what God was doing, where he was, and how he was going to keep working and moving in the things that were happening. How will those who come after us in this new type of world continue to know God? I was just talking with the Mishes about how it's funny for us to think about how different it was. To think about how, especially when we think about state-sponsored religions, people were afraid to get away from that, because then what if people choose not to follow God? Like, we know what's good for them. They need to be in church. Why doesn't the government just tell them they have to be? And it's funny for us today because we've come so far from that, and we've seen both the fruits of that, and we've seen some of the difficulties in that. But in all of it, God works, right? God was sovereign when the Church of England was the state-sponsored religion. God was sovereign when the Catholic Church was the only type of Christianity, way back when we studied the very beginning. He was sovereign in the early church right after the apostles. He's been sovereign in all of it, and he continues to be sovereign today. So this is a great tie-in, really, when we think about the Hebrews study and saying Jesus is better. That remains true today. It was true in the 1700s, that Jesus is better, that God is in control, and that Jesus, Joe said this last week, who holds all things, can hold my life too. He's got it. At the end of the day, I really can lay my burdens at his feet and rest easy because he holds all things. Because he created the world, he holds it together, he keeps everything moving, and the things that surprise me, the things that give me anxiety, the things that make me worry, they don't surprise him. He remains God, and he remains sovereign. So as we leave today, I want you to be encouraged, I want us to be encouraged together that God was working then. He was working in this century we're studying today. He is working now, and we can trust him with all things. The big world events that seem impossible to understand, and even with the things in our lives that we struggle to understand, that we struggle to walk through, we can trust him with all of it. Let's pray. God, I thank you for your sovereignty. Every time I study history, I'm just reminded of some things that don't change. The fact that you are our sovereign God that we can trust, that doesn't change. The fact that we're confused by the world events around us, that doesn't change. But God, I ask that you will teach us more and more to trust in you. That as we look back, that we will be reminded that you're the same God yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And that our faith will be increased as we study the things that have happened before we came along. God, as we think about the church in the 1700s, especially in the U.S., as we think about this changing society, this changing church landscape where more and more denominations were cropping up left and right, where people were worried about what the world would look like if there wasn't a government-mandated religion, God, we see how you worked and moved in that, and we see how you work and move today. Teach us to trust you more and more. Teach us to love you more and more. And in our study, God, draw us close to you in relationship. We do love you, God. In your name, amen. Thank you guys for your time. Next week, we'll be looking at the 1800s.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Sunday Sessions. We're hopeful that you found this content so important for your spiritual growth that you'll want to learn more. Each week, we provide a PDF handout for notes and additional resources for study on the topic. You can always find these resources in the show notes or by visiting cvconline.org/Sunday Sessions. May the Lord bless you this week, and we hope you'll come back next week for another episode of Sunday Sessions.